Welcome everyone to this session of studying Jamgun Mipham Rinpoche's The Sword of Wisdom. As always, please generate the awakened intention of wishing to become clear on what is being talked about here, what is written about here, what is taught here, with the appreciation that the author here, just like the Buddha, is somebody who penetrated to the core of what we truly are, and also as such discovering and diagnosing what really the issues are that need to be addressed for us to also realize what truly is. And the reason for doing this is compassion, seeing how much suffering there is in the world, in our own experience and around us, on the basis of not properly understanding ourselves, not properly understanding this mind, and not understanding everything that constitutes our experience. And that's where the Buddha, he saw that when mind goes into a deluded place, we have this cycle and self-perpetuating, if you like, cycle of samsara. All along the while, this nature, the fundamental nature, never changes. And so the Buddha, he intended really with his teaching to eliminate the causes of this confusion, this samsara, understanding that the ground, and you could say underlying confusion, there's this ground that is not contaminated, that is not deluded. And so his teaching was all about us essentially eliminating what was, you could say, delusion, and realizing what was truly there. So we talk about the path in terms of these two aspects, elimination and realization. And our motivation when we come to something like this is really based on understanding how much suffering there is in samsara, and the fact that we can do something about it. We're extremely fortunate that from the time of the Buddha down until today, there are still great masters who can teach us. In this context here, we have the theoretical teaching, and the context of its application, we have living lineage masters who appear in this world, speak our language, and present the medicine that can cure our particular predicament. So we have all the conditions in our hands. What's particularly helpful is, of course, the actual process of transformation of our being, in the sense of basically healing ourselves, curing ourselves. But it requires application. And that's where it's so helpful for us to study, to really understand increasingly how valuable the path is, and what exactly is it that we're eliminating. And also this also helps us to put words to what we're doing, develop a language. And what we have in the modern situation is very much a lack of language that enables us to communicate with the world around us, enabling others to understand that this condition that we experience as sentient beings within this world is a curable condition. This suffering is not basic to who we are. It's not something that's a given. So that's something that is not generally understood, and it's something that basically, as Buddhists, you could say there's a certain responsibility to share this, not as missionaries, but at the same time, having a language helps very much in our conversations with others. And as much as there are very profound methods in the Buddhist teaching, unless we actually have a language that enables others to appreciate that this is not just a question of something what they imagine, something about going into some, I don't know, people have funny ideas of what the Buddhist path is about. So unless we have a language, actually, we're not able to clarify that. And also, the general assumption is that something like the practice of the Buddhist teaching is about something that's not real. It's not scientific. It's not logical. It's based on beliefs and blindly tagging along with gurus and all sorts of ideas. And that's why it's very important that the Buddhist teaching is understood according to its, you could say, valid epistemology, according to its valid valid reasoning that establishes the insights that it offers. So that's where this kind of teaching that we're undertaking here is immensely valuable in developing this understanding, and you could say developing a language. So we'll engage in that for that reason. This is our, you could say, preparation with bodhicitta, and then invoking then the wisdom of the author of the work that we're studying through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara. You open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of courage, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham, Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So in the, let's see here, oh my, oh, thank you very much. That's, I've never done that before. It's in honor of the audience that my Word document has decided to draw attention to itself. Wishes to sort of act up. All right, I think everybody has noticed. Okay, well, look, I'm gonna have to just, something is not quite, yeah, save. Anyway, presently we're going to be studying basically these three verses today. This philosophy is unmistaken. All errors have been eliminated. The mind is free from doubt. About 3 points. I pay homage to Manjushri, the treasure of wisdom. So that's actually the first stanza that we're looking at. And let's see here if I can get it all up and running again. Okay. I think we're good. So we're looking at this verse of homage. And of course, the first is, this philosophy is unmistaken. Well, when you say something like that, you're going to have to substantiate it. But of course, everything that we do in terms of applying our knowledge always is based on the assumption that it's unmistaken. Until we actually have truly established that things are working, we don't send a space shuttle. We don't launch it. We work until we are sure that everything is right. And then we can say, now everything is clear, the space shuttle and the technology, it is there, it's ready to go. And so in this sense, similarly also with what we have in the Buddhist teaching, and this is of course not just something that was just, we didn't just get message back from the engineers, last week that everything is working. This is 2,500 years of verified, valid insight, what has been verified. So in that sense, we can say here this philosophy, or rather this path, or however we choose to speak of it, that is what we spoke about last time. It is a science in the sense of it's a system of assertion that are made with certainty, because, as it says here, because they come from investigating and analyzing through scripture, which is reliable information. The engineers at NASA, they will also rely on manuals and various existing studies. So they also use scripture and reasoning. Well, they'll use their intelligence to work with the given information to arrive at a particular insight. So similarly also here. So that's what we then refer to as this. In the Tibetan, it's Jumta. In Sanskrit, it's Siddhanta. So this is, you could say, unmistaken and valid because it accords with how things actually are. So next we'll then sort of go into depth with regards to this. But you might say, well, I already trust the Buddhist teaching. Yes, that's good. There's every reason to do that. But it's very good to see how this trust is consolidated, or how this trust is established on a basis of not just blind faith, but on the basis of reasoning, logical arguments, and so on. And this helps us. This helps us, unless we're very removed, then we would inevitably come across situations where we can see the nature of the teaching. How should we understand it in various situations and in various contexts? So here, Kenshin Shirapalden, he says, first, to establish the validity of the teachings, Buddhist philosophy is valid because it hasn't the slightest defect in terms of being mistaken. That's very sweet. That's obviously what we normally would call rather circular logic. It's valid because it's not mistaken. This, of course, remains to be substantiated. But of course, we appreciate that, and this is important. So that's where you could say we go to this with that, you could say, initially giving it according it trust as being unmistaken and valid. It says here, this is because the Buddha Bhagawan, the one who taught these tenets, eliminated all errors, including the two obscurations and their seeds and habitual tendencies. Our teacher is called a great being because his vision came from valid, direct perception, and he perfected the qualities of wisdom, compassion, and power. So, of course, we can't establish something as valid just because it comes from somebody we trust. That's famous. But at the other hand, there is a very important component that we need to understand when it comes to the Buddhist teaching, is that it's not about an objective truth out there that we can say this here, for example, this weighs 87 grams or whatever it might be. This is about something that is realized on the basis of an individual subjective application. So we rely on not facts and data, but we rely on experience. And that is the experience is only valid as long as it's embodied effectively in someone. So you could say non-confusion is a possibility, but it's only valid the moment that we have somebody who actually embodies and fully, you say, manifests non-confusion. So that's where we look at someone like the Buddha, and we can see there is a case of someone who is free from, and here then we get a bit specific, the two obscurations. And that's where, again, looking at ourselves and applying introspection, we can see there's something that we can see that obscures us, and that's our emotions, the afflicted states of mind. So this is what we call the obscurations of afflictions. And then there's what we call cognitive obscuration, which is simply the deluded assumption that there's a solid existing self. Now, presently, we're running quite a few classes that are onto this whole, you could say, delusion about imputing a self, which in fact, there is no basis for that. So nevertheless, we speak about then this as an obscuration, it's a cognitive obscuration. So these two, the foundation, which is the cognitive obscuration, and the emotional obscuration, these essentially, they prevent us from properly seeing without confusion. So that's where the Buddha is defined in terms of someone who actually broke through this. So not only that, but also the seeds and the habitual tendencies, what we call the other obscurations as well, the karmic obscuration and the habitual obscurations. So as such, then, what the Buddha saw was valid on the basis of being free from the ordinary obscurations, and as a result of that, giving rise to then the qualities of wisdom, insight, compassion, which was what naturally originates from there no longer being the fixation and the nervousness, the preoccupation around the self. That's where then compassion, love, warmth manifests, and power, no longer being diminished by confusion and the neurotic patterns. Then there's the capacity that emerges. So these three qualities really are how we define the qualities of enlightenment: wisdom, compassion, and power. Buddhist philosophy, then, Shirapalden says, is proven to be a pure and valid scriptural teaching through the three types of investigation and through reasoning that fulfills the three criteria for valid evidence in relation to the three aspects of valid inference. So this is where we want to go a little bit into this, because that is exactly how then you would say Buddhist logic or Buddhist epistemology, Buddhist valid cognition is founded on these three types of investigation. And they fully fall in under the, within the parameters of what we in the modern world accept as science, namely something that is verifiable, something that can be observed. But it's, again, it's within the realm of the subjective, within the realm of our experience. And again, we can clearly see what is lacking in material science is the actual dimension of experience. It's simply not understood. Of course, it's observed, and there's plenty of data around what individuals and groups and so forth they experience, but an actual understanding of what this is, experience actually, cannot be subjected to the ordinary measurements that we have in terms of quantifying, measuring, and essentially you could say objectifying. So that's where there is an additional dimension that is essential, really, because it's through this dimension of the subject, the observer, the experiencer, that we construct all the various data, all the various theories, hypotheses, and knowledge. So that's where that's absolutely essential for us to have a valid science that we include then the dimension of experience. But the same criteria really apply, namely you could say the empiricism of observing and verifying or falsifying. So this is what we're looking at here, and that's where we talk about three types of investigation. So here, and I'm drawing this mainly from the footnotes, I'm putting in a little bit of commentary myself to clarify some of the things, but essentially here the three types of investigation, which are known as the three types of valid cognition, are direct perception for manifest phenomena, and that's anything that we observe empirically, except also in Buddhism, then we include also the dimension of thought. So that is what we can observe. We can observe that there is my mouse here on the table, there's my watch, there's a camera. All of this we can see, but we can also see what's happening within the mind. Presently, I'm sitting here talking, and I have a pretty good idea of what's happening within my mind. So that's where we talk about direct perception, manifest phenomena. And then we have inference. Now, there are things that I cannot see, but I infer it. I'm hearing a bird out there. I can't see it, but on the basis of inference, I can then see that this hidden phenomenon is presumably a bird. And then there's valid scripture for very hidden phenomena. And then again, that's where we would rely on, just like in science, we rely on reliable statements about, you could say, those who have done particle physics, that they have some things to say about that. And it's definitely something that even if I went to out here, I can go and check out, is there a bird? But that's hidden phenomena presently, but I could go and find out. As far as very hidden phenomena goes, I'd have to have particular instruments to look into, you could say, the dimensions of particle physics. And similarly, also when it comes to the mind, then there's also hidden phenomena in terms of, you could say, what's embedded on the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, which is the scope of sublime beings who actually have direct insight into this. So that's why you could say, for those who have the instruments, which is then a mind that's clear and free from confusion, you could see a properly polished instrument, a properly maintained, a properly calibrated instrument will then be able to see clearly what is then hidden and also very hidden. So the three criteria for valid evidence, and this is what we call a syllogism, and this also you have in Greek philosophy, or from the time of Greek philosophy, and that is then where we can make an argument when we sort of make statements. We can sometimes just throw things at people and say, agree with me, or get lost. But usually that doesn't really take us that far. And usually for us to actually make valid statements, we make arguments, we substantiate it. You shouldn't drive your car over the speed limit because it's dangerous for yourself and for others. So it's not just that we say don't drive more than 60, but we actually make an argument for it. And so that makes a strong point. So that's where we win others over. They go, oh yeah, okay. So here we talk about 3 criteria for valid evidence. And this, of course, is when we're beginning to look at phenomena. And for example, we say phenomena don't have the reality that they appear to have. Let's say phenomena are impermanent. Or we talk about things as being empty of inherent existence, emptiness. Then we don't just say that there's a special state you go into and then you sort of understand emptiness. There's a special state you go into and you understand things are impermanent. Even though, of course, we sometimes talk about arhats who can see, who directly perceive the moments of subtle impermanence. We talk about sublime beings who have realization of emptiness, and that's all very good. But presently, we can also infer logically that yes, anything that is compounded, and also on the basis of our experience, yes, they are impermanent. So we might not have the direct vision of impermanence, but we can logically infer it to the degree that we have trust in the truth of impermanence. Similarly, also, we might not have direct experience of emptiness, but we can also see that the solidity that we attribute to phenomena is not founded on anything other than our deluded assumptions. So we can infer and logically establish an understanding of what we mean with emptiness. So the way that these criteria, they work, in Tibetan it's tsulsum. It says they are the presence of the reason in the subject of debate. Okay, well, I'll give an example. And then the positive pervasion and the counter pervasion. So let's say a pot is impermanent as it is a composite phenomenon. So that's where the argument is that we're talking about this pot that we're so attached to. It's impermanent. For a number of reasons, then this is good to know. So that's where we then say, okay, impermanence is intrinsic to the pot, but then we make an argument for it. And that's where we say that thus we have the presence of the reason being the reason actually that's not right. That's actually not right. I have to say this here where it says I say impermanence. No, it's not. That's actually not the reason. The what needs to be proven is the impermanence, but the reason that it is that it's a composite phenomenon, that's actually the reason that's present within the subject, the pot. So Paul dies for that. Anyway, 2, the positive pervasion is then, and this is where we then, as someone who hears this, we say, oh yeah, well, that is definitely true. That's something that's true. That's where we say composite phenomena are impermanent. This is something we can agree on. Again, this is verifiable. This is not just because the Buddha said so. So that's where we say positive pervasion, composite phenomena are impermanent, and counter pervasion is that something permanent cannot be composite. So that's where we would say that we simply cannot find anything really that is not composite. Everything is composite, and hence also we don't find anything really that is permanent. And so that's where we can validate the truth of this, that it obviously applies in both the sense of the positive state, namely composite phenomena and permanent, and the counter pervasion. If it was something that is permanent, that cannot be composite then. So for something to be permanent, it would have to not have any parts or anything that could come undone. So that's why when we have that, then we're kind of like, then we're quite sure about what is being said. So that's also when we have that, what a lot of us come across, namely the whole proposition about emptiness, which says on a more in-depth level, we can also say all phenomena are empty as they arise dependently. So that's the presence of the reason that they are dependent arising, that's in the subject. If we look at the subject, yes, that is a dependent arising. All phenomena are dependently arisen. And so the positive pervasion is dependently arisen phenomena, which is then all phenomena are empty. And the counter pervasion is, for something to be non-empty, it would have to be independent. So we can essentially say all phenomena are conditioned. And that's why we could say it's for, and hence they are empty. And that's why we say if there was phenomena that was not conditioned, then it wouldn't be empty. Then they would be unconditionally always existing, always there, having always been, always will be, and don't move. But such phenomena don't exist. And so that's why we would say if for something to be not empty, it would have to be unconditional. That's not that hard to think. We really could probably understand how everything is conditioned, and we operate with conditions all the time. The fact that I can move my arm through space is simply because it's not fixed as something unconditional. The fact that our thoughts are something that is always moving and based on how much sleep we got, how much food, how good our health is, how good food we eat, etc., the environment, then our thoughts and our mood and so on is in a particular way. So we continually operate with conditioning. So that is then where we have covered two. The first were the three types of valid cognition, namely direct perception, inference, and valid scripture. That was the three types of valid cognition. Then we looked at the three criteria, which are then these, you could say, the valid evidence on the basis of presence, the presence of reason in the subject of debate, the positive and counter pervasions. Now, the three aspects of valid inference, that is based on convention, that these are inference based on conventional usage, inference based on the power of facts, and inference based on trust. And that's, for example, where I say, okay, Argentina. Well, Argentina for sure, I believe there is Argentina. And that's just because everyone's talking about Argentina in the conventional sense. It is probably based on facts, right? There have been people who have been there. And also then when I hear about people talking about Argentina, the way it's being presented, I can have trust in it. This is a very ordinary sort of immediate experience of just, you could say, valid inference based on these conventional aspects. Anyway, the bottom line is that this kind of, you could say, investigation that we're doing here, and this is significant, it leads to us actually, it leads to us having trust in the teaching. I often mention my own experience of coming to Buddhism, where it was immensely appealing, but it took about 1.5 years of really actually being tortured. I used to think I was going to get an ulcer. I was only 17, but I thought I'm going to get an ulcer because it so annoyed me. I was subscribing to something that was everything I had rejected previously, namely a system of, you could say, something spiritual, and even spirituality, was in those days something very sort of dodgy and, basically equivalent to religion and what have you. So it was very, very dodgy. And a lot of the people around me, they were just these hippies. They were just sort of like, oh, it's wonderful with the llamas and all of that. It was very sweet people, but, not really sort of, you could say, hard, not really possessing this kind of, you could say, irrevocable, valid argumentation or proof. So that's where, on one hand, there was being drawn to this teaching. There was so much to make sense, and there was so much strange stuff. So it took about 1.5 years until I came across something for me that really actually brought about certainty. And then I was like, oh, this is for real. So that's where, once that takes place, then there's a whole different relationship to the journey. It's not just that you're part of this club, but you're part of doing something that really gets to the core of things. You've found the cure for cancer, now you apply it. So that's where we talk about this doubtless certainty. There is the cure that really goes to the bottom of what afflicts everyone, everywhere, universally. And that's then, you could say, valid. And that's where there's an incredibly deep appreciation of the nature of what the Buddha says. So this leads to doubtless certainty. And this is again something that in the other study that we're doing on Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche, this is where Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche, he aligned himself with a lot of scholarship in Tibet. And of course, Mipham Rinpoche was mainly a yogi, mainly a practitioner. But he also understood how there was a culture of only accepting something when you actually really tried and tested it. And so Mipham Rinpoche, as much as he wanted people to practice, he also wanted everyone to have certainty as they go to practice exactly what they're doing. So here then, Kenshin Shilapalden says, these lead to doubtless certainty. The essence, these above aspects of valid cognition, or these three kinds of valid cognition, they lead to doubtless certainty, the essence of intelligence, which is Manjushri, the great treasure of wisdom. So we can understand Manjushri as this condition of non-doubt, of clarity. Alternatively, one could say that profound intelligence comes from the blessing of Manjushri, that our intelligence is something that can take place on the basis of the, you could say, presence of this innate confidence. So, of course, here we're not talking about Manjushri uniquely as the Bodhisattva Manjushri, but also as this quality of Manjushri as an innate capacity that we possess. Either way, respectful homage is paid with body, speech, and mind to Manjushri as the treasure of wisdom. So our entire being is surrendering to this. And that's also for us to surrender. I don't know, like I was just saying, for me, difficult to surrender to something unless there's a strong case being made for it. So that, but the path, it demands actually complete engagement, because we are working with our entire being, not just part of it. So that's where we give ourselves surrender completely, and that's where we bow down with body, we express our appreciation with speech, and particularly with the mind then, with a deep openness, deep devotion, faith, and so forth, we bow to Manjushri. So this is then the homage, and then it says the scriptural support, and then there we go in. Okay, in the Buddhist teachings, we have the you could say the endorsement of what's talked about here. So it says the great master Dharmakirti, who Dharmakirti lived in the 6th century Common Era, and again was somebody who very compassionately engaged in conversation with the world around him. And as such, he operated a lot with this pramana, establishing the validity of Buddhism through some very important teaching that he undertook. So he says there in his 3,500 stanzas, his autumn commentary on the commentary of valid cognition, the Pramanavartika, the Tsemanamdrel, he in there then says, in one way, the Buddha's teaching should be called inference, because they are unfailing words that eliminate errors. So we're not going blindly with it, we're doing it on the basis of our own validation. One can be certain about what to accept and what to reject, and the methods to use, because the Buddha's main points are unmistaken. This inference also applies to others. So this is where we can be clear on what to accept and what not to accept. And that's where we arrive then at the appreciation of the validity of the Buddha's teachings. When the teachings on what to accept and reject and the related methods are unmistaken, then they are unfailing. So this is again where we have the foundations for accepting this, and then we apply these, seeing that they are working, they are unfailing. An example is the explanation on the Four Noble Truths. So when we talk about the Four Noble Truths, we're not importing something metaphysical or some a priori position. We're simply relating to what everybody knows. There's suffering, and we can also see how our individual suffering is tied up with an attachment to a self. We can verify that this is not something we're stuck with. This is dynamic. It changes, and so it's not constantly there. It's a curable condition. So, and finally, when we apply the remedies, you could say lifestyle, calming the mind, insight, and so forth, we can actually see how the the cause of suffering can be eliminated and we can be free of suffering. So that's not about something where we just blindly believe. So that's where an example is then the Four Noble Truths. To fulfill their aims, people rely on what they have previously known to be true. Yeah, we look at our own experience, and they accept similar unmistaken things. There would be no point in a teacher giving a wrong explanation because it would be contradictory and counterproductive. Yes, that wouldn't be, you could say, that would be pointless. And that, of course, this is essentially where we would say such a teacher would not be qualified to be a teacher. Dharmakirti also says, anyone's words that are verified through valid cognition as being unmistaken attains the status of scripture. There's an important point here, because what we mean with scripture is not just the scripture, but valid science. It means that it's something that is established on the basis of valid cognition. So that's what we mean with scripture in the Buddhist context, that it possesses these qualities. So the scripture then is based on either direct perception, inference, or it's the scope of sublime beings, those who have you could say, the instrumentation to validate what is what we call hidden, very hidden phenomena. So as such, then, this is what we accept as scripture. Just like if you go into a university library, you can probably, you go into the Department of Science, and in there you could say some of the science might be outdated, but in general it's something that has been established on the basis of what we generally attribute as valid methodologies, epistemically valid methods. So it says here, then Chandrakirti says, it does not make sense for words to be scripture simply because they were not produced by a person. And this is an interesting point, and this also we have in the Abrahamic context, and also you had it in India, that something that was written by an ordinary person was sort of regarded as, rather mediocre, or, at best sort of just temporarily helpful. For something really to be scripture, it would have to come from the God. That's also what we have in the Abrahamic traditions, where we would say, oh, but this scripture here, it was not written by an ordinary person, this was written by God. So of course, also, for example, in the Dharma tradition, we have similar, where we would say, well, this is not written according to an ordinary mind, it's written by somebody who has wisdom. But the implication here is then that it is someone or something where there's not the presence of ordinary confusion. And this doesn't have to be, you could say, a supernatural entity, supramundane individual like a god or whatever. This could equally take place within the context of a sublime person, a sublime human. So for something to be scripture, it just needs to fulfill the demands of valid cognition, and it's not about coming from somebody who's then, you could say, out of this world. So Dharmakirti then also says, even though others similarly use the word scripture in general, it is only because of valid cognition that a text is scripture. So we have various kinds of scriptures, obviously holy books around the world, but as far as if we're aiming on the path of enlightenment, as we understand it in a Buddhist context, then we would only rely on scriptures that actually possess these qualities of what we can rely on. This is actually an interesting point, because we could also find things that are not necessarily defined as Buddhists, but nevertheless are valid arguments that have come about externally. For example, some years ago, I remember when Rinpoche was teaching the Four Seals, what really qualifies as Dharma, the theme that we have in What Makes You Not a Buddhist. He was saying, if somebody comes up with the insights that you have in these four insights, impermanent suffering, no self, and the peace of nirvana, if somebody comes up with that, he said, even if they were some New Age guru, and Rinpoche says, sitting on the beach of Byron Bay, he says, the traditionalists, if they come up with that, even such dubious character, if these four are there, then Rinpoche said, the traditionalists, they might kick and shout, but it actually would have to be deemed valid, valid Dharma. And that's what we mean here with scripture. So here Dharmakirti says the definition of a scripture is unmistaking words verified through valid cognition. So that's where we verify, is impermanence a fact? Is, suffering on the basis of the neurotic mind, is it a fact? Do things have an ultimate self, etc.? We can verify. So anyway, this is here some scriptures that then validate that. And if you read Sherpa Palden's own commentary, it actually goes on to quite some extent, and that's where I've shortened this a little bit. But they basically all bring home this point. If you have the book, please, by all means, don't miss out on that. But here for the presentation, I think it might get a little bit long. Then the validity of the teacher. So that's again where we have in the text, the second line then says, all errors have been eliminated. Now those errors, the errors that take place in terms of our misunderstanding the nature of reality, this comes about through the subjective dimension, and that's where someone who has seen through that, well, that's then the individual subject that has eliminated that, and that is then in this case then the Buddha. The Buddha has established this. So the second line of the root verse establishes the validity of the teacher. Having analyzed and established Buddhist philosophy as the unmistaken and valid scriptural teaching of the noble Dharma, one goes on to establish the teacher, the Buddha Bhagavan, as one who has completely eliminated all mistakes and ignorance. He is a great being whose valid cognition knows and sees all phenomena without obscurations through direct perception. So this is where then the premise is that we have somebody who's reliable. Yeah, he has someone who has valid insight and has directly seen phenomena for what it is. So we would say then there's such an individual. Sublime beings have what we call yogic valid cognition. In the case of a Buddha, there's what we call omniscience. There's a complete elimination of all cognitive obscuration. But even so, someone who begins to, even on the path, begins to have less and less and less obscuration, begins to see the truth of the Dharma, the truth of the true nature of phenomena with increasing accuracy. And this is then what we refer to as yogic valid cognition. We'll get to that. So this takes place in terms of the individual experience. And then Sherpa Palden says, valid teachings are dependent on a valid teacher. The cause for becoming a valid teacher is the perfect intention of wanting to benefit beings. Bodhicitta. The perfect activity of teaching leads to the perfect effect, becoming a sugata for one's own sake and a protector for the sake of others. So we talk about the two benefits. The two benefits is of eliminating confusion and samsara for oneself and benefiting others, not going into nirvana, but benefiting others compassionately according to their particular needs. So that's where we establish the validity of the teacher. And again, here we have scriptural support. The great master Dignaga. Dignaga, he lived a couple of centuries prior to Dharmakirti, but is really seen as the father of what we call Buddhist epistemology, Buddhist logic. So Dignaga, he says, I pay homage to the valid great being who wishes to be a benefit and is a teacher, a sugata, and a protector. So this is how Dignaga views the Buddha. In his commentary to the Compendium of Valid Cognition, the Pramana Samuchaya, the Semakuntu, Dignaga then says, in order to generate devotion, the first chapter of this treatise praises the Bhagavan's genuineness because he had the perfect cause and the perfect result. The cause is his perfect intention and perfect activity, his lives as bodhisattva. His intention is the wish to benefit others, and his activity is giving the teaching. That's then after attaining enlightenment. The result is the perfect benefit for self and others. The benefit of oneself is to become a Sugata, one gone blissfully. Sugata should be understood as having three meanings. One meaning is being very beautiful, yeah, gone to bliss, like someone with an excellent body. Another meaning is being irreversible, like somebody cured of smallpox. This means gone to this place, is now there, you know, you know, yeah, irreversible. And the third meaning, being complete, like a full vase, having these qualities. These three meanings show the especially perfect benefit for oneself. A Sugata is free from the attachments of non-Buddhists. Non-Buddhists, they believe in a self, they believe in solidity of phenomena and so forth. They have what we call these extreme views or conceptual constructs. And has, as such, the Sugata is free from these and has gone beyond the levels of those in training and those beyond training. So these refer to then those bodhisattvas, arhats, and also bodhisattvas, those who have yet not attained in complete enlightenment. The perfect benefit for others is being their protector with the purpose of liberating them. To the teacher who possesses those qualities, I pay homage. The great master Vasubandhu says, I pay homage to the one who has completely abandoned the darkness of ignorance, who leads beings out of the mire of samsara, and who teaches according to the true meaning. So this is then where we then have these scriptures that validate the, you could say, logic, the validity of the teacher. Okay. Let's see if there's some questions. Unfortunate the use of scripture as a word. Yeah, I know. Given Abrahamic tendencies to misunderstand its meaning in the Buddhist context. Yes, but this is where we need to also, Buddhists need to appropriate words also. I mean, we could say scripture, then what is it again? Tenshu, scripture. What is it again? Yeah, I think it's Tenshu. We could use the Sanskrit or the Tibetan, but we're going to might as well use English. And scripture does infer or imply something that has a sacred quality. So that's where we're using scripture here. Maybe some other translator might use another term, but we're also just going to say, well, in this context, it's like a lot of things that we're using. For example, the word karma, as Buddha says it's been appropriated by other, subcultures, if you like, but then use karma in their particular way, and enlightenment, like Tongtse Rinpoche often talks about the problem around the word enlightenment, because in a Western context, enlightenment means essentially just this sciences, you could say, breaking free from the constraints of religion. And so we always have these issues with the vocabulary, and where we simply just have to redefine according to our present purposes. Yeah. Okay, there's no more questions right now, so yeah, I would say, oh, there's one here. Okay. Surely difficult for translators indeed, seeking words that are imbued with cultural meanings. Yes, some they're a bit more fearless than others. Like, the word dikpa in Tibetan means essentially negative actions that create suffering for you. And so we sort of use, we sort of pussyfoot around the word sin because we don't want to use sin. But then again, some translators, they will use sin. And, it's a powerful word, sin, but yes, it has a lot of connotations. And so, the majority of translators, they're like, no, we don't want to use the word sin. But, some will say, well, we have words in the English language that imply particular things. And sin is one of them. And we could very well redefine them in a Buddhist context. So we have that discussion continually, right? Anyway, that happens. Yeah. So yes, you're right. It's not easy. Compassion for the translators. Anyone's words that are verified through valid cognition as being unmistaken attain the status of scripture. Yeah, that's a bit like what we have in science. So, for example, if Werner Heisenberger, he writes something, he would write it, and it would be established as then, if you like, scripture, because he would establish it on the basis of his own findings, and you could say what is sound science. So that's where we then validate it. And we'd also look then at Heisenberg. Once we've established that Heisenberg's propositions and hypotheses can be validated, then we have a lot of respect for Werner Heisenberg. And that's where he then becomes seen as a teacher. And then we, you could say, have respect that comes from that. So that's where we then end up with also validating. It's because it comes when, then next time Werner Heisenberg has written in the other works, then they begin already there. We have, as you could say, an increased trust in the material. So, so in anyway, yes. So the argument here is very good. Anyone's words that are verified through valid cognition as being unmistaken attains the status of scripture. In this case, when I see an apple and say there is an apple, would that statement, there is an apple, become a sort of scripture? Yes, because you've made a valid statement, assuming it is an apple, and somebody says, you know, she's saying this is apple. Well, it certainly is. She's a reliable person. So that's where we could say that's a valid statement. Whereas you have a box, and inside it you have, you know, God knows what, and you say this is an apple. That would actually be a hidden phenomenon. And then if people have already seen that you speak the truth, when you talk about there's apples, there definitely is apple. There are apples. But if it's hidden inside the box and you say this is an apple, then people are prone to believe you. But until actually you established yourself as someone that's reliable, then, you know, they might say, well, she's speaking the truth, maybe not, you know, 50-50 chance, sort of. Okay. Trying to place what I'm hearing, the need to study the foundations, not getting too far ahead by hearing these teachings. Yeah, I mean, this is really, you could say, where we arrive at a point where we then say, wow, what we have in the Buddhist teaching is real. It's not just that there's, you know, the Dalai Lama's a nice guy, and, you know, it's nice to have a compassionate mind, it's nice to be peaceful, but actually seeing, wow, this insight that we have in the Buddhist teaching. For example, saying all phenomena arise on the basis of the mind, and mind is ultimately empty. These are really big statements about our reality, and it goes far beyond what the ordinary propositions we have in, for example, in physics and the sort of general science. These kind of statements, everything arises in mind, goes far beyond that. The sort of the understanding of what we call samsara nirvana, enlightenment, rebirth. They're big themes that go far beyond what we ordinarily have in the sort of the modern materialist science. So of course our materialist science is very, very helpful for so many things, from technology to medicine. But when it comes to the really big understanding of reality, then this is what we're dealing with here. And so that's why it's necessary to understand what is it the Buddhist teaching is basing itself on. And that's where we then, when we begin to see, you know, we're sort of in the modern world, we're brought up with, you know, in the modern world, we're sort of at the apex, the highest achievement of all civilizations at all times. And so there's sort of like what other people have found, well, they're not that advanced, you know, technologically, and what they're talking about sounds like religion and mysticism. And, you know, it's probably just based on superstition and, you know, voodoo and cultural preferences, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we would say, well, it's nice, you know, awfully nice people, but not necessarily the highest insight into reality. And that's what you could say 95% of, you could say, the modern people would really presume. And this is what we're challenging here. No, actually, the Buddhist teaching is it's not supernatural, and it's not superstition, it's not mysticism. It actually operates on the same, what we call epistemic premises. It operates on the same sound foundations for science as the science that we know and respect that deals with the material. The science knows and deals with, you could say, our reality as it's understood through experience, the observer, which we can argue for, this is the observer, is far more what we can call ontologically primitive. It's far more ontologically basic. It's far more basic for our reality and our experience. First person consciousness, the most real thing we have. However, in the modern science or in the modern worldview, it's like, well, we don't quite know what it is. Anyway, we're concerned with the objects out there. So for us to actually move into a space of truly appreciating, wow, this is insight into reality. This is for real. This is the greatest insight there could ever be. For us to actually fully embrace this kind of trust requires that there is some, you could say, substantial, that we're actually introduced to the foundations for these insights, for this science, for this knowledge. Science has premises because it is sometimes challenged by new evidence, unlike Buddhist tenets. Well, that's true, and this is, but no, yes and no, because what's valid, we could say so good about modern science, and this is the famous point that Karl Popper made, which is the foundations for science is that it's falsifiable, and that means we have an insight until we see something more, like, for example, now we understand the secret behind migrating birds and so forth. But just wait, in 20 years, there'll be another one. Now we know what's behind migrating birds, etc. So that's where science is falsifiable, because it's something that we can look at. We can say, I have 5 fingers here. This is something that can be, if it's true, well, then it's verified, it's validated. If it's not true, it can be falsified. But that kind of science is very different from saying, there's a great creator that has created everything and so forth. That we can't really use because it's neither verifiable nor falsifiable. So that's where the value of such a science is that it doesn't go into sort of big unverifiable claims, but it just operates with what can be verified empirically, if you like. And that's why we trust science. There's websites and Facebook groups that are F ... I love science, because it's so reliable. And our point for studying this is to see Buddhism operates from the same, we're going to have F ... I love Dharma, because that's where we're finally getting to the bottom of the mysteries that rule us in terms of our experience. But we're not doing so on the basis of belief. We're doing it on the basis of what we can validate and verify. So that's where Buddhist tenets, they operate on being challenged. Remember the Kalama Sutta, where the Buddha said, don't accept my words out of respect, but on the basis of your own analysis, just like you wouldn't purchase gold without validating it. You challenge the one who's selling the gold, you challenge them. The Buddha, you challenge the Buddha. You challenge are things truly empty? Are things impermanent? Well, that's where we need to say then, well, if it has the 3 criteria of valid cognition, if it's the 3 types of valid cognition, what we can experience, etc., then yes. So we just like I was saying with Werner Heisenberger, we look at his things and we can see he's making some valid points. We accept it, yeah. And then we're more prone to sort of also trust things that perhaps we don't have access, we don't have the same instruments that you would have in the study of quantum mechanics and so on. But nevertheless, we then begin to trust these guys. So yes, that's what I thought was science is falsifiable. And similarly also with Buddhism, yeah, we're making some statements and we should go in and challenge them. We should if they're wrong, we falsify them. Even the Dalai Lama says if people find something that's falsifiable, then good. Hey, for example, there's this lovely story about the Dalai Lama where he says, somebody says, has your study, your interest in modern science, has it ever shaken your Buddhist beliefs? And the Dalai Lama says, no, on the contrary, it's actually strengthened my Buddhist belief. He says, only one victim. I no longer believe in Mount Meru, which is the sort of classical Indian cosmology, where you have Mount Meru in the middle, you have the four continents, and there's a lot of sort of detailed description in the old sort of cosmology of India, and the Buddhists sort of tagged along with that. So you have that in the Abhidharma and so forth. But that's really just, you could say, secondary. That's some more trivial information about the world around us. So as far as the basic premises of the teaching go, which is the elimination of subjective confusion goes, well, that's where the premises for science are completely in alignment with what we're doing in the Buddhist teaching, and that's what we're studying here. Yeah. How do you reconcile siddhis with valid cognition? Well, first of all, it could be witness, but I understand what you mean, and it is the what emerges on the basis of a greater capacity of a greater individual. So it's a bit like you have people who do extreme sports, and they're able to do these extraordinary things. I can't do what people, the triathlon people might be doing, but it can be done. And so it doesn't really fall into the supernatural. It simply just falls into, you could say, a greater capacity. And so similarly also siddhis. Yeah. The siddhis are very much based on, you could say, a greater understanding of our reality. And again, this is where you could say the primacy of consciousness plays in, because when a consciousness is no longer limited by solidification, well, then it begins to interact with the world in a different way. And that, of course, extends beyond the ordinary materialist scientific view, but it's perfectly in harmony with the understanding of the empty nature of phenomena. So we have this famous debate between the sort of the logicians and Milarepa, where Milarepa just makes an argument by passing his hand through all phenomena are empty. They can, the logicians, they say, well, you can't meditate on emptiness because you don't have the theoretical understanding. And Milarepa says, it's true, I don't have a lot of theoretical understanding, but I do understand phenomena are empty. And then he passes his hands through the pillar, yeah? So that's siddhi. But that is essentially comes from then, you could say, a proper understanding of reality. Yeah. And Buddhist tenets, though open to challenge, are not falsifiable. Well, it's a bit like once something has been, once there's a hypothesis that has been proven valid, then it becomes what we call valid science. It becomes, you could say, it becomes something that we can rely on. But we can always go back to the laboratory and test the hypothesis and test the validity of our particular science. So similarly, also, we're encouraged to do that. When we come across the teachings, we're encouraged to validate. And that, again, this is where this is helpful, because that's where we can then use these. We understand how validation takes place in the same way that we have it in modern science, on the basis of empirical observation, on the basis of inference. And then when we do rely on others, we only rely on others who are, you could say, established as reliable. Some of this is daunting. Not reliant on the cultural idea of intelligence. Well, it is relying on a cultural idea of intelligence, because universally everywhere in the world, then people, you could say, they would only trust when they can see something has been, you could say, proven itself, and that's universal. So just like, but of course, here we're talking about, and I mentioned this last time, here we're talking about something that's not known in our culture, just like in some countries, where they'd never seen a car before. They actually put grass out in front of the car, thinking there must be some great animal inside there that pulls this thing. And so in the case of the mind, which is not so well understood in our culture, we're here introducing a whole dimension of how we could how mind can be understood, but not on the basis of belief, but on the basis of us applying an analysis. And so this is where, again, what we've just looked at today, these ways in which we essentially can prove and establish the validity of our understanding. This is then, you could say, methods that we apply in terms of validating what the Buddha is saying. In the traditional context, and I was also saying, with people just trust. And I also just trust blindly. My mechanic says, just the car's good now. I trust it. I don't go under the hood and mount it and just say, thank you so much. I put the key in the ignition and I can drive the car. So that's where there's an element of trust. And this, of course, also is what you have in traditional cultures where people just sort of tag along blindly. Because it's proven. But again, if you were to want to validate it, and in our culture, then something like enlightenment, something like samsara, nirvana, rebirth, and so on, they're unknown entities, and they all come back to an understanding of the mind and the consciousness, and understanding that reality doesn't really exist the way that it's constructed as material, solid out there. So that's where we're introducing a radically different, what we call ontology, or radically different understanding of reality, but it's not founded on just some mystical something or other. It's founded on what we can actually validate and what we can prove as reliable. So this gives us a lot of this provides then a foundation of proper trust in the nature of the path. Like I often say, and I also mentioned last time, Tonstikan Rinpoche said, the highest goal really of all, you could say, philosophy is really to provide faith. Because of course what we're doing in the Buddhist teaching goes far beyond just the rational project of data and knowledge and so forth. It's about transforming the mind. So the highest goal really of the path is really to completely eliminate the ordinary dualistic mind that grasps onto ideas, thoughts, and that's why the yogi is someone who's soft and open and wonderful, and someone who has insight into reality and tremendous compassion and strength. But that takes place on the basis of freeing ourselves from some ordinary limiting ideas and insecurity. And to engage in the path really is about working with this mind. So we need to understand, where does the mind go wrong, and what can we do to counter this mistake? And that's where we have this study then of how the mind actually mistakenly constructs reality. And it's not just then that we're given some teachings of this is how it is, but we're encouraged to actually verify the validity of that. And once we have verified the validity of it, we have no hesitation in engaging in the path. Great intro to our study today. Thank you. Okay, good. I'm glad. Thank you so much for doing this, because like I said, this will enable a greater faith in terms of our own practice, and it will provide a language in terms of us, you could say, living consciously, living fully, wholeheartedly within our particular culture, and being willing to actually engage in conversation, and not being, you could say, it's not, sometimes, people think, oh, I have to I don't want to hear this, or I don't want to hear that, I want to live in a bubble of Buddhist, I want to live in a Buddhist bubble. And that's because it's sort of the hearing other things gets confusing. But if you have this down, then actually you can see what's valid and what's not valid. You can see how compassion is valid, how anger is not valid. You can see how the view on things as solid, it's what we're going to look at here. It's conventionally valid, but not absolutely valid. So what's going to be the sort of theme that we're going to be looking at are then the two truths, and understanding then how this applies in terms of our experience and our reality. Yeah? Okay, all right. So through all our births, wherever we may be born, sorry. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you very much. We went a little bit over time. I hope that's okay. You're so welcome, La.